Fridays, my bosses give me a chance to talk about something close to my heart. I've been wanting to talk about the cancel culture for a while. That's this mob mentality that generally operates on social media. And when outraged or offended or insulted by something or someone, they take action by demanding that the culprit get canceled or fired. A few days ago, former D-backs broadcaster Thom Brennaman made the ultimate mistake that a broadcaster can make. He said something horrible and ugly on an open mic. It was a homophobic slur, and within minutes, the hashtag #FireThomBrennaman was trending. He didn't even finish the broadcast. He simply apologized and left the booth. An hour later, he had been suspended by the Reds, and Fox Sports has suspended him for the upcoming football season. Now, I'm not here to defend what Brennaman said. It was bad, and it was very offensive. But I do think that as a society armed with the power of social media, we are now swimming in dangerous waters. Why? Because as woke as those people calling for Brennaman's head say they aren't. They too have built-in prejudices, and they're not as good or as pure as they portray themselves to be. And forgiveness is a virtue that this culture doesn't seem to embrace. The truth is, we're all flawed creatures. We should be allowed to make a mistake and not have it define who we are. This cancel culture really seems to feel that they can bring about change by destroying someone's life, by being judge and jury and executioner. And sometimes they're right, but what happens when they're not? When they unfairly call someone out, dragging not only them, but their families into a bottomless pit of shame and embarrassment. Do we really want to live in a society where an angry segment of the population can instantly punish someone with a scarlet letter for a stupid mistake or one bad moment? That's not to defend the Harvey Weinsteins and Jeffrey Epsteins of the world, but I think we've given people armed with a .45 caliber hashtag too much power. And some of those people have a tendency to rush in without any grace and hang the offender. And if this is allowed to continue, if we continue to buy into it, one day we could be the ones dangling from that rope.